The lace on her wedding gown was still pristine when the telegram arrived, shattering her world. Abandoned, destitute, and desperate, she traded her bridal veil for a train ticket into the untamed frontier. But what happens when a broken woman meets a hardened cowboy with a dangerous secret of his own? The scent of white lilies was supposed to be the fragrance of Elena Montgomery's new beginning. Instead, it became the smell of her absolute ruin. It was a crisp October morning in Boston, 1878. The pews of Trinity Church were packed with the city's elite, murmuring beneath the vaulted ceilings as the organist played the prelude for the third time. Elena stood in the vestibule, the heavy silk of her gown feeling less like a celebration and more like a shroud. Her father had passed away only 6 months prior, leaving behind a mountain of hidden gambling debts that threatened to consume the family estate. Her marriage to Charles Harrington, a wealthy shipping heir, was the only thing standing between Elena and the debtor's prison. But Charles was 30 minutes late. The heavy oak doors of the vestibule creaked open, and Thomas, Charles' closest confidant, slipped inside. He wouldn't meet Elena's eyes. His hands trembled as he extended a small folded piece of parchment. "I am so sorry, Elena," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with pity. "He isn't coming." Elena snatched the note. The elegant looping cursive belonged to Charles, but the words felt like physical blows. He wasn't just leaving her, he was leaving her for her younger sister Josephine. The two had eloped to Europe on a midnight steamer. Worse still, Josephine had forged Elena's signature to liquidate the last remaining trust fund their father had left, taking every cent of Elena's survival money with them. The betrayal was so profound it stole the air from Elena's lungs. She didn't weep. The shock was too absolute, freezing her blood. She stepped out of the church, ignoring the gasps of the congregation, and walked the 3 miles back to her foreclosed childhood home, in her wedding dress, the expensive silk dragging through the mud and horse manure of the Boston streets. By the next morning, the bank manager, a ruthless man named Mr. Abernathy, arrived with the deed in hand and the local constable at his back. Elena was given 1 hour to vacate. Standing on the cobblestone streets with nothing but a single leather valise, Elena had a choice: become a scullery maid or vanish. She walked to the offices of the Boston Daily Advertiser to scan the employment columns, but it was a different section that caught her eye. It was an advertisement placed by the matrimonial news agency. Respectable rancher in Laramie, Wyoming territory seeks a woman of good breeding and strong constitution for matrimony. Paid passage upon agreement. Safety and shelter guaranteed. The name listed was Mr. Buff, Henry Caldwell. It was a desperate, dangerous gamble. The West was notoriously brutal, a graveyard for the weak. But Boston held nothing for her but the sneers of high society and the crushing weight of poverty. Elena pawned her mother's silver locket, the only thing Josephine hadn't stolen, wired a telegram to Laramie, and purchased a one-way ticket on the Union Pacific Railroad. The journey was a grueling 7-day descent into a world stripped of civility. The velvet-lined passenger cars of the East quickly gave way to the wooden benches and soot-choked air of the westward trains. Elena sat rigidly by the window, her fine clothes slowly accumulating a thick layer of coal dust and prairie dirt. She watched the green rolling hills of Pennsylvania flatten into the endless brown oceans of the Nebraska plains. Sleep was fleeting, constantly interrupted by the violent lurching of the train and the raucous laughter of prospectors and drifters sharing her car. She clutched her valise to her chest, jumping at every shadow. She was trading a known hell for an unknown one, banking her entire existence on the word of a man she had never met. She read Henry Caldwell's brief, stilted letters over and over. He promised a sprawling ranch, a warm hearth, and a life of quiet respect. It was a lifeline she desperately needed to believe in. But as the train finally ground to a screeching halt at the Laramie depot, amidst a swirling storm of alkali dust and the deafening bellow of cattle, Elena's fragile hope was about to be violently tested. Laramie was not the romanticized frontier of the dime novels Elena had read. It is a harsh, bleeding wound of a town carved into the unforgiving Wyoming dirt. The streets were rivers of thick, churning mud, lined with slapdash wooden buildings that looked ready to collapse under the fierce prairie wind. The air smelled of unwashed bodies, raw whiskey, and livestock. Elena stepped off the train, her legs trembling from a week of constant motion. She adjusted her modest wool coat, trying to maintain an air of Eastern dignity as she scanned the crowded platform. Men with hardened faces and low-brimmed hats pushed past her. She looked for a man holding a sign, or someone who matched the description Henry had given her. Tall, graying at the temples, wearing a brown suit. An hour passed. The platform emptied. The chilling realization that she was entirely alone in the Wild West began to seep into her bones. Gathering her courage, Elena carried her valise to the local mercantile. The bell above the door jingled, drawing the attention of a balding man behind the counter who was meticulously weighing flour. "Excuse me," Elena said, her voice raspy from the dusty air. "I am looking for Mr. Henry Caldwell. I'm expected." The shopkeeper stopped what he was doing, his eyes widening. He looked Elena up and down, taking in her refined, albeit dirt-stained appearance. "You're looking for Henry Caldwell?" "Yes. He owns a ranch south of town." A heavy, uncomfortable silence fell over the store. The shopkeeper wiped his hands on his apron, his expression turning grim. "Ma'am, I don't know who told you Henry had a ranch, but he didn't own dirt. Henry Caldwell was a card sharp and a drunk, and as of 2 nights ago, he's dead." The floor seemed to tilt beneath Elena's feet. "Dead? Shot in the back over at the Bloody Basin Saloon," the shopkeeper said bluntly, though his eyes held a flicker of sympathy. "Caught dealing from the bottom of the deck. I'm real sorry, Mom." Elena stumbled backward out of the store, the wind whipping her hair across her face. Dead. The man she had crossed the country to marry was a fraud, and now he was a corpse. She was stranded in the Wyoming territory with 50 cents to her name. Before the panic had fully set in, a heavy hand clamped down on her shoulder. Elena gasped and spun around. Standing before her was a man built like a mountain, wearing a finely tailored but ostentatious red vest and a bowler hat. His smile was cold, revealing a gold tooth. "You the mail-order bride Caldwell was bragging about?" he asked, his voice like grinding stones. "Who are you?" Elena demanded, trying to step back, but his grip was iron. "Name's Dutch Miller. I own the Bloody Basin," the man said, his eyes raking over her with predatory calculation. "Your dearly departed fiancé owed me $600. A massive debt. Now out here, debts don't die with the man. They pass to the kin. And since you came all this way to be his wife, I reckon you belong to me now. You'll work off what he owes in my saloon." Upstairs, the implication hit Elena like a physical strike. "I am not his wife. We never married." "Let go of me." She struggled, but Dutch only laughed, dragging her toward the muddy street. Passers-by averted their eyes. No one crossed Dutch Miller and Laramie. "Let the lady go, Dutch." The voice cut through the chaos of the street like the crack of a bullwhip, calm, low, and laced with absolute authority. Dutch stopped, his grip loosening slightly as he turned. Elena followed his gaze, standing 10 paces away, leaning casually against the wooden post of the boardwalk, was a cowboy. He was tall, his broad shoulders casting a long shadow in the afternoon sun. He wore a dusty duster coat, faded denim, and a battered Stetson pulled low over his eyes. His thumb rested lightly on the silver buckle of his gun belt, mere inches from the pearl handle of a Colt revolver. "This ain't your business, Wyatt," Dutch snarled, though Elena noticed a bead of sweat break out on the saloon owner's forehead. "I'm making it my business," Wyatt replied, stepping off the boardwalk. His spurs jingled a slow, deliberate rhythm. He stopped right in front of them, pushing his hat back to reveal piercing, storm-gray eyes that locked onto Elena for a split second before snapping back to Dutch. You know the law, Dutch. She ain't legally bound to Caldwell's debts. Let her go, or I'll collect that bounty the marshals put on your brother in Cheyenne. Your choice. Dutch's jaw clenched. For a long, tense moment, the only sound was the howling wind. Then, with a curse, Dutch shoved Elena forward and stormed off toward the saloon. Elena stumbled, but Wyatt caught her arm, his grip firm but gentle. You all right, Mom? Yes, thank you, Elena breathed, her heart hammering against her ribs. She looked up at her savior. Up close, Wyatt's face was rugged, lined by the sun, and hard-living, with a jagged scar cutting through his left eyebrow. I don't know how I can ever repay you. I have nothing. I know, Wyatt said plainly. He let go of her arm and adjusted his coat. I overheard the mercantile owner. You came out here to marry a ghost. Elena looked down at her muddy boots, the shame and exhaustion finally threatening to break her. I have no money for a return ticket. I have nowhere to go. Wyatt was quiet for a long moment, studying the street and looking back at her with a calculating intensity. You need a roof, protection, and a way to survive this town. Yes, Elena admitted, her voice barely a whisper. And I need a wife. Elena's head snapped up, her eyes wide. What? Wyatt sighed, running a hand the back of his neck. I ain't looking for romance, ma'am. I own 3,000 acres of prime grazing land out by the Sweetwater River, but the government's trying to seize half of it on a technicality with the Homestead Act. The local judge is a stickler. He ruled that unless I am a settled married man providing a stable home by the end of the month, the land reverts to the state, which means the railroad barons snatch it up. He looked her dead in the eye, his gaze unwavering. I need a legal wife on paper to satisfy the judge and save my ranch. You need a name to keep wolves like Dutch Miller off your back and a safe place to sleep. It's a business arrangement, nothing more. You keep my house, I keep you fed, clothed, and protected. In a year when the deed is locked tight, if you want to leave, I'll buy your train ticket back east myself. Elena stared at him. She had just survived one betrayal at the altar and another by correspondence. Now a heavily armed stranger was proposing marriage in the middle of a muddy street. It was madness. But as she looked past Wyatt, she saw Dutch Miller standing on the balcony of his saloon, watching her like a hawk waiting for a wounded rabbit. Boston was gone. Charles was gone. A sister had ruined her. Elena lifted her chin, calling upon the last reserves of her shattered pride. My name is Elena Montgomery, she said, extending her dirt-smudged trembling hand. And I accept your terms, Mr. Sterling, he said, taking her hand in his rough, calloused grip. Wyatt Sterling. Let's go find a preacher. The marriage of Elena Montgomery to Wyatt Sterling was officiated in the cramped, whiskey-scented back office of Judge William A. Carter, a man whose gavel seemed to be a heavy glass tumbler. There were no vows of eternal devotion, no rings exchanged, only the scratching of a nib pen on a territorial homestead affidavit. When Elena signed her name, her hand did not shake. She had traded the gilded cages of Boston for the sprawling, lethal beauty of the Wyoming Territory. The Sweetwater Ranch was located 20 miles from the squalor of Laramie. It was a staggering expanse of golden prairie grass rolling beneath a sky so impossibly blue it hurt the eyes. The house itself was a sturdy, low-slung cabin of hewn pine backed against a ridge of red rock. It was isolated, quiet, and utterly foreign. For the first month, the arrangement was strictly business. Wyatt slept in the bunkhouse with his lone, aging ranch hand, a leathery old Texan named Elias Cobb, while Elena took the main cabin. True to his word, Wyatt provided for her. He bought her durable cotton dresses, sturdy riding boots, and a heavy wool coat. In return, Elena applied the fierce discipline of her Eastern upbringing to the wilderness. She learned to scrub clothes on a washboard until her knuckles bled, to butcher a prairie hen without flinching, and to bake sourdough bread in a cast-iron Dutch oven buried in coals. Wyatt was a man of infuriating silence. He worked from before dawn until long past dusk, breaking horses and mending barbed wire. Yet Elena caught him watching her. Sometimes when she was hauling water from the creek, she would look up to find him leaning against a corral post, his gray eyes tracking her with a guarded, unreadable intensity. He treated her with a rigid, almost reverent respect, never crossing the threshold of the cabin without knocking, never raising his voice. But the frontier does not allow for quiet secrets to stay buried. The first sign of trouble arrived with the frost of late November. Elena was sweeping the porch when she saw a column of black smoke rising from the southern grazing pasture. Wyatt and Elias rode out in a fury, returning hours later smelling of ash and sweat. Someone had deliberately torched 3 miles of fencing and poisoned a watering hole, killing 6 head of cattle. "Dutch Miller," Wyatt grunted, throwing his hat onto the cabin table that night. His knuckles were bruised, a muscle in his jaw ticking furiously. Elena set a plate of venison stew before him. Why? Because of the $600 the dead man owed him? That seems excessive for such a sum. Wyatt looked up at her, the flickering light of the oil lamp casting long, harsh shadows across his scarred face. "It ain't about Henry Caldwell's debt, Elena. It's about the land, and what's beneath it." Elena sat across from him, her heart skipping a beat. "What are you talking about? Gold?" Wyatt let out a dry, humorless laugh. "I wish. Gold you can dig up and spend. This is worse." He reached into his coat and pulled out a heavy iron key. He walked over to the stone hearth, knelt, and pried up a loose floorboard. From the dirt cavity below, he hoisted a soot-stained lockbox and set it on the table. With a turn of the key, the lid popped open. Elena leaned in, expecting to see stacks of currency. Instead, she saw a stack of faded, crinkled parchment. She reached out, her fingers trembling, and unfolded the top sheet. It was a bounty poster from the Missouri State Police, dated 1872. The drawing was of a younger man, but the piercing eyes and the line of the jaw were unmistakable. "Wanted, dead or alive, William Billy Sterling. Train robbery, murder, and treason. $5,000 reward." Elena dropped paper as if it were a coiled rattlesnake. She backed away from the table, her breath hitching. You're an outlaw." "I was," Wyatt said, his voice dropping to a gravelly whisper. He didn't move toward her. He kept his hands flat on the table, palms up in a gesture of surrender. "During the war, I rode with a partisan ranger outfit. When it ended, some of the boys didn't want to stop fighting. They started hitting Union Pacific payroll trains. I was young, stupid, and angry. I rode with them." He looked down at the lockbox. "Our last job was a disaster. A guard got jittery and started shooting. 2 innocent people died. I took a bullet to the shoulder, took my share of the loot, and rode into the night. I didn't spend a dime of it. I buried it right here in the Sweetwater Valley before I bought this land under a clean name." Elena processed the information, her mind racing. "And Dutch Miller knows." Wyatt nodded slowly. "Dutch used to run with a rival gang back in Missouri. He recognized me the day I rode into Laramie. He knows the Union Pacific payroll is buried somewhere on these 3,000 acres. He's been trying to buy me out, scare me out, or legally freeze me out so he can claim the deed and dig up the valley. The Homestead Act requirement was his doing. He paid off a clerk in Cheyenne to flag my claim as fraudulent because I was a bachelor." "So you married me to secure the deed," Elena said, a sudden sharp ache blooming in her chest. "Not to save me from Dutch, but to save your stolen fortune." "No!" Wyatt stood up abruptly, the chair scraping violently against the floorboards. For the first time, raw emotion cracked his stoic facade. "The money is cursed," Elena promised myself I'd never touch it. "I bought this land through honest, back-breaking work. This ranch is my redemption. It's the only clean thing I have." He took a slow step toward her, his grey eyes searching hers desperately. "When I saw you in that muddy street staring down a monster like Dutch Miller with nothing but a pawn ticket in your pocket, I didn't see a tool. I saw a woman with more grit than any man I'd ever ridden with. I needed a wife on paper, yes, but I chose you because I knew you wouldn't break." Elena stared at the hardened outlaw standing before her. She thought of Charles Harrington, the refined, wealthy coward who had abandoned her at the altar. Charles wore tailored silk and smelled of cologne, but he had the soul of a rat. Wyatt Sterling wore dust and blood, but he had offered her the only genuine protection she had ever known. Before Elena could answer, the distant, sharp crack of a gunshot echoed across the valley. Elias Cobb burst through the cabin door, his face pale beneath his weathering, a Henry repeating rifle clutched in his hands. "Boss, riders coming down the ridge. 10 of them, maybe more. They're carrying torches. They ain't here to talk." Wyatt's demeanor instantly shifted from vulnerable man to lethal predator. He snapped the lockbox shut, kicked it back under the floorboards, and strapped his gun belt around his waist. He tossed a heavy Winchester rifle to Elias. "Barricade the windows," Wyatt ordered. He turned to Elena, grabbing her by the shoulders. "There's a root cellar under the kitchen rug. Get down there. Do not come out until you hear my voice. You understand?" Elena looked at his hands, feeling the heat of his grip. The terrified Boston socialite would have run and hidden in the dark, praying for a savior. But the woman who had crossed a continent, survived a ghost's betrayal, and learned to bake bread in the ashes, was done hiding. "No," Elena said, her voice steady and clear. Wyatt blinked. "Elena, this ain't a parlor game. Dutch is coming to kill me and burn this place to the ground." "This is my home too," she said, stepping out of his grip. She walked over to the gun cabinet beside the door and pulled out a double-barreled shotgun, Elias used for hunting coyotes. She broke the barrel, loaded 2 heavy brass shells, and snapped it shut with a satisfying clack. "Mr. Abernathy took my family home in Boston. I will be damned to hell before I let a saloon keeper take my ranch in Wyoming." "Not true." A slow, fierce grin spread across Elias's wrinkled face. Wyatt stared at her, awe stripping away the last of his guarded armor. "All right, Mrs. Sterling," he murmured softly. "Keep your head down and aim for center mass." The night erupted into chaos. Flaming torches arced through the black sky, landing on the porch roof and the dry grass near the barn. The deafening roar of gunfire shattered the silence of the prairie. Bullets tore through the wooden walls of the cabin, sending splinters flying like shrapnel. Wyatt and Elias returned fire from the front windows, the rhythmic crack-crack of their rifles holding the riders at bay. Elena knelt by a side window, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. Through the gun smoke, she saw a shadow creeping along the side of the cabin, a man carrying a bundle of dynamite toward the foundation. Elena didn't hesitate. She shoved the barrel of the shotgun through the broken glass and pulled the trigger. The recoil slammed into her shoulder with brutal force, knocking her backward. A scream pierced the night outside, followed by the heavy thud of a body hitting the dirt. The dynamite rolled harmlessly away. "Good shot," Elias hollered over the din. But there were too many of them. The front door groaned under the weight of heavy boots kicking against the wood. Wyatt cursed, drawing his Colt revolver. They're trying to breach. Suddenly the front door burst inward, tearing off its iron hinges. Dutch Miller stood in the threshold, the silver-plated revolver in his hand, a crazed, triumphant look in his eyes. Smoke billowed behind him, framing him like a demon ascending from the pit. "It's over, Billy," Dutch roared over the gunfire. "I'm taking the map, the money, and the deed. And maybe I'll take the Eastern girl back to Laramie just for sport." Wyatt didn't say a word. He stepped into the open, raising his Colt. Dutch fired first. The bullet grazed Wyatt's ribs, tearing through his duster coat. But Wyatt didn't even flinch. His retaliation was instantaneous and terrifyingly precise. Wyatt fired twice, The first bullet shattered Dutch's right knee, sending the massive man crashing to the floorboards with a howl of agony. The second bullet struck the cylinder of Dutch's revolver, blowing the weapon apart in his hand and severing 2 of his fingers. The remaining outlaws, seeing their leader screaming and bleeding out on the floor of the cabin, broke rank. The sound of retreating hoofbeats echoed into the night, leaving behind only the crackle of burning grass and the groans of the wounded. The silence that followed was heavy and thick with cordite. Wyatt stood over Dutch, his gun aimed squarely at the man's forehead. Dutch looked up, pale and sweating, waiting for the execution. But Wyatt slowly lowered his hammer. "Elias," Wyatt said, his breathing ragged as he clutched his bleeding side. "Tie him up. We're taking him to the territorial marshal in Cheyenne. Governor Thayer has been looking for an excuse to hang him. Let the law have him." Wyatt turned around, dropping his gun onto the table. He leaned against the wall, clutching his side, his face pale. Elena dropped the shotgun and ran to him. She tore a strip of fabric from her petticoat and pressed it hard against the wound on his ribs. Her hands were shaking now, covered in soot and his blood. "You're reckless," she choked out, tears finally spilling over her lashes, cutting clean tracks through the dirt on her face. "You could have died." Wyatt looked down at her, lifting a calloused hand to gently brush a stray lock of hair from her cheek. "I had a reason to stand my ground today." Loud taught. 2 weeks later, the winter snows arrived, blanketing the Sweetwater Valley in a serene, blinding white. The bullet hole in the door had been patched, the deed was permanently sealed in their name by the land commissioner, and Dutch Miller was awaiting the gallows in a Cheyenne prison. Elena stood by the hearth, watching the flames dance. Wyatt walked up behind her. He didn't wear his gun belt anymore. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a train ticket. It was a first-class passage on the Union Pacific, destination Boston. "The deed is secure," Wyatt said quietly, his voice tight. "Dutch is gone. You kept your end of the bargain, Elena. I told you I'd buy your way back east when it was safe. You have a share of the cattle money now. You can go home, buy back your father's house." Pointed. Elena looked at the ticket. It represented everything she had wanted 6 months ago. Safety, high society, her old life. She took the ticket from his hand. Without a word, she turned to the fireplace and dropped the paper into the roaring flames. They watched in silence as the ticket curled, blackened, and turned to ash, drifting up the chimney. Elena turned to face her husband. She reached up, resting her hands against the solid expanse of his chest. "Mr. Abernathy can keep the house," she whispered, looking up into his stormy gray eyes, now soft and vulnerable. "My home is right here." Wyatt let out a breath he seemed to have been holding for a lifetime. He wrapped his arms around her waist, pulling her flush against him, and finally, after months of agonizing distance, lowered his head and kissed her. Tasted of smoke, winter air, and the fierce, undeniable promise of a real beginning. If you loved this Wild West tale of betrayal, survival, and unexpected romance, hit that like button right now. Don't forget to share the story with your friends who love a good historical drama, and absolutely smash that subscribe button so you never miss another thrilling adventure. Drop a comment below would you have stayed on the ranch or taken the train ticket. Let us know. Zal?